Hey y'all, welcome and/or welcome back to my channel. My name is Janae, if you didn't know, and today's video is another true crime episode. So if you're ready, let's go. All right, y'all. So the nails are basic again. This week I just did a nude color, and y'all, I never really thought that I would be like a long nail girly, but I love it when my nails are long like this. Like, I don't know. I really could have swore it was something else that I wanted to tell y'all before I started today's video, but I can't remember right now, so we're just gonna go ahead and hop right into today's case. And today we are in Delaware, and we're gonna be talking about a man named James B. Clark Jr. And James B. Clark Jr. was born on February 8th, 1957 in Seaford, Delaware. And as soon as James was born, he was put into the foster care system. So we don't know what his birth parents' names are, and we don't know why he was put into the foster care system. I'm not sure if his parents abandoned him, if his father was in the picture, if his mama was young. Like, literally, we know nothing about James's birth family. However, not too far away in a place called Kent County, Maryland, was a 35-year-old man named James B. Clark and his wife, who was 34 years old, named Elizabeth Clark, were looking to adopt a baby. And just 4 months after baby James was born, the Clarks adopted him, giving him the name James Bernard Clark Jr. And for the rest of this video, we are going to call James Jr. Jimmy, and then James Sr. will be just James. So once Jimmy was adopted, he became James and Elizabeth's first and only child. And for the first year of Jimmy's life, everything went great. He was everything that James and Elizabeth imagined that he would be. And when Jimmy turned 2, the family would move from Maryland to Wilmington, Delaware, where the remainder of today's case takes place. But right now, Jimmy is 2 years old, and even though the Clarks love their son and he's everything that they could have wanted thus far, they wasn't very affectionate with him, even at this tender age of 2, because it said that Elizabeth told Jimmy that he was adopted. And she didn't just tell him that he was adopted. She told him that he was adopted, just like the family cat. Now, Jimmy is 2 years old. He probably don't even understand the concept of adoption. But then you tell him he like a cat? That's wild to me. But anyways, it's during this second year of life that Jimmy started exhibiting some troubling behavior. Jimmy had this thing where he liked to hit on other kids. And I feel like that's pretty normal for the toddler stage. All toddlers go through that phase where they start hitting people, but the parents, they kind of correct and redirect them. And they teach them that, hitting is not right. You don't hit nobody unless they hit you, at least that's how I teach my kids. But you correct and redirect, and you move on. Your kid learns that hitting is not okay, and we move on, right? Well, Elizabeth didn't see it like that. So when Jimmy was just 2 years old, Elizabeth would get him into behavioral counseling. She would go as far as to get psych evals on him. And this is a pattern that we will see continuously throughout Jimmy's life. So now it's time for preschool, and Jimmy is about 3, 4. That's usually when preschool starts. And little Jimmy's poor behavior spills over into the classroom. So much so that he was kicked out of not 1, but 2 preschools. Because you see, Jimmy had this thing where he wasn't just hitting people no more. He was actually throwing rocks at the other kids. And so both preschools was like, no, we cannot have him here. He is a threat and a danger to the other children. And so they kicked him out. And so now Elizabeth decided that it would be good for Jimmy to start going to therapy. And so he started going to therapy weekly in hopes that talking out whatever he was going through would kind of reel his behavior back in, or at least get him to understand his behavior more, or whatever therapy does for behavior. I don't know. But it seems like the therapy was working, because Jimmy was able to start kindergarten at Greenville Elementary School. And for a little while, it seemed like everything had gotten better. It seemed like Jimmy had gotten control over his emotions and his lashing out. However, he only made it to the 2nd grade before his bad habits started reappearing. And it was in 2nd grade that he would actually get expelled from Greenville because he ended up cutting a student with a nail so bad that they needed stitches. And he ended up having to finish 2nd grade at Siena Hall. And after he completed 2nd grade at Siena Hall, he would start the 3rd grade at the Child Study Center in Baltimore, Maryland. And what it sounds like is that he actually went away for schooling this time, and that he only came home on like holidays, long weekends, and stuff like that. And after 3 years of being at the study center, James returned home in 1968, just in time to start his 5th grade year back in public schools. And he was released from the study center as much improved, so they felt comfortable enough to allow him to be back in public schools. But that did not last long at all, because in October of 1969, Jimmy was expelled yet again. And what did James and Elizabeth do after he was expelled? They sent him away again. And this time he will be sent to the Governor Bacon Health Center, which is a treatment facility for kids and teens who were emotionally and socially disturbed. And he will be here from 1969 until 1971. And this is when they decided, okay, we're going to give this public school thing another go round. We're going to try it again. And in 1971, Jimmy would start his 7th grade year at Stanton Junior High School. And he will remain at Stanton Junior High School until March of 1973. But you wouldn't believe that it's not because he was expelled this time. He actually left the school because he went to jail. So the reason that Jimmy went to jail this particular time is because on March 5th, 1973, Jimmy is 16 years old and he decides to skip his last period class. And while he was skipping school, he came across a 3-year-old girl named Kathleen who was playing in her backyard. And it's unclear if he lured Kathleen away or if he just snatched her up, but he ended up taking Kathleen into the woods, where he proceeded to beat her up pretty badly and strangle her as well. And he must have thought that he killed Kathleen because she did pass out due to the strangulation. Luckily, she was only unconscious, and at around 3:30, when another Stanton Junior High School kid was walking from school, he heard Kathleen crying and he was able to take her home, and the police were called. And the police ended up talking to a security guard who said that he had seen James running from the area in which Kathleen was found at around 4:30 that afternoon. So what it sounds like, and what the police theorized, is that Jimmy thought that he killed Kathleen, left, and then came back. But when he came back, he found that Kathleen was gone, and that's why he was running, because he was scared. And so they had Jimmy and another young boy who also skipped their last period class on their radar as suspects. And they honed in on Jimmy because Jimmy wore braces at the time of the attack, and marks on Kathleen were consistent with someone who wore braces. And so they arrested Jimmy and charged him with kidnapping and assault with attempt to murder. And on February 14th, 1974, Jimmy was sentenced to life in prison. However, he and his lawyers appealed his sentence based on unnecessary suggestive out-of-court identification of Jimmy by a 3-year-old. Basically, they were saying that Kathleen identified Jimmy outside of court and that they could have coerced her in some way, shape, or form to identify Jimmy as her attacker. Basically, you can't believe a 3-year-old, pretty much. And so the courts granted him a new trial. But Jimmy didn't want to go to trial because he had already gotten sentenced to life once, and so he didn't want to take that chance again. So what he ended up doing was entering a Robinson plea on August 9th, 1977. And I had to look up what a Robinson plea was, and it's pretty much pleading guilty, but you're not admitting to doing the crime. And this type of plea is entered mostly when people are intoxicated at the time of the crime and just don't remember doing the crime. So they're like, okay, well, yeah, I guess I'm guilty, but I don't remember doing the crime, so I'm not going to say that I did the crime. And so because of this plea, he was sentenced to the maximum sentence, which was 30 years. But he had got 4 years time served, and so he only had to serve 26 years. But he only ended up serving 21 years, and he was released on April 22nd of 1994. And upon his release, he went back to live with his parents, James and Elizabeth. And by this time, James and Elizabeth was 71 and 72 years old. They was heavily involved in church, and they were really just living their best old people lives when Jimmy re-entered society. And they welcomed Jimmy back into their home, back into their lives. But I can't say that it was with open arms, because Elizabeth had reservations about Jimmy getting out of jail. She was a little nervous about her son being reintegrated back into society. But nonetheless, that was their son. They loved him, and they did want to help him, you know, get back into the swing of things. So Elizabeth and James, They taught Jimmy how to drive a car. They helped him look for jobs. And they pretty much just did everything that they knew how to do to help their son get back up to date with what was going on in the outside world. And everything was good for about a month. I mean, it was a little tense in the house because Jimmy just didn't seem like he wanted to get a job, and Elizabeth and James wanted him to hurry up and get a job. But other than that, it was okay. But everything would go to hell on May 22nd, 1994, when police received a call from Jimmy at around 9:26 p.m. saying that his parents had been shot. So when police arrived, they find James dead in the garage from multiple gunshot wounds, and they find Elizabeth in an upstairs bedroom, also deceased from at least one gunshot wound. And they find Jimmy also. And they find Jimmy, which I don't really know where they found him at, but he was bleeding from the top of his head. So he was transported to the hospital where he received treatment for his injury. So after Jimmy got treated, the police wanted to do their initial interview with him. And Jimmy told the police that he had been driving around from about 4 or 5 o'clock until about 7:30 when he went back home and saw that there was blood leading to the garage. And once he made it to the garage, he actually ended up tripping over his dad. And once he looked at his dad, like while he was kneeling down looking at him, he knew that he had already passed away. But as he's kneeling down, he said that he saw this flash and then he was knocked unconscious. And a little while later, he woke up, but then he blacked back out. And then he woke up again. But this time when he woke up, he said that his eyes were glued shut. And then he realized that his eyes had been glued shut from the blood that was coming from his head. So what he did was he went inside, washed his face off, and then went upstairs. And that's when he found his mom and then called the police. But the crime scene wasn't given that. It wasn't given that at all. The crime scene actually looked like there was a staged robbery. There was blood all over the place that looked like somebody tried to clean it up from the ceilings, from the carpet, from pretty much everywhere. And there was a hole in the wall directly behind James's recliner chair. And what it looks like was that James was reclining in that chair when he was shot. And so right away they were side-eyeing Jimmy's story, but they didn't really have any proof that it was him. So once he was released from the hospital, he was, set to go. But they did want a second statement from him. So they took him down to the police station for a second interview where there was a lot of inconsistencies between his first story and his second story. And while Jimmy was being interviewed, detectives got word that there had been another 911 call in regards to James and Elizabeth that occurred just 6 minutes prior to Jimmy calling. So what happened was James and Elizabeth had a friend named Mrs. Wrigley that they went to church with, and they were supposed to have dinner with Miss Wrigley at around 5 o'clock that day. And Miss Wrigley had called at around 1 p.m. to confirm the dinner date. And when 5 o'clock rolled around, James and Elizabeth didn't show up. Now that was already a little suspicious because they would have called if they weren't going to be able to make it. But once 8 o'clock rolled around and she hadn't heard anything from them, she got worried. And so she called one of their mutual friends who lived closer to James and Elizabeth and wanted him to go check on the Clarks. And so he did this. And when he got there, he said he noticed their car in the driveway, but he knocked on the door and there was no answer. And so he called Mrs. Wrigley back to tell her that the car was in the driveway, but they wasn't answering the door. And knowing that Elizabeth had concern about Jimmy being released from jail, Miss Wrigley decided to call the police. And this happened at around 9:20 p.m. Like I said, 6 minutes before Jimmy called. So now the autopsy report comes back for James and Elizabeth, and it was determined that they had passed away between 12:45 p.m. and 1:15 p.m., give or take 15 minutes, based off of the food contents that was in their stomach being consistent with a brunch that they had after church. And based off of everything that they had just found out, they realized that Jimmy had to have been at home at the time of James and Elizabeth's murders, because when Mrs. Wrigley called at around 1 p.m., Jimmy was the one who answered the phone. And if he answered the phone and they were murdered between 12:45 and 1:15, the only person who was there was Jimmy. So they pretty much concluded that Jimmy was the one who killed his parents. And so they arrested and charged him with their murders. And Jimmy ended up confessing, and he pretty much said that they had gotten into an argument earlier that day and he flew off the handle and murdered his parents and then tried to stage it to look like a robbery. He even went so far as to pull out some of his hair. And stuff it in a bullet hole so it looked like he got shot in his head and his hair came out with it. And in the end, Jimmy was sentenced to death and he was executed on April 19th of 1996. And that concludes today's case. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Y'all, running upstairs is not conducive at my big age. Not too far away in a place called Kent County, Delaware. Nope, they're in Maryland. Girl, damn it. Not too far away in a place called Kent County. Not too far away in a place called Kent County, Maryland. Oh my gosh. That's usually when they taught Jimmy how to drive a car. They showed him, what else they show him? And once he got to the garage, which I don't know why you following the blood trail instead of, I don't know. Maybe I would too. I don't know.